have people joining us from all around the world. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are joining us from. And welcome to today's webinar, which is all about buying right, getting procurement right in the digital age. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, which is a publishing house that serves civil servants all around the world. So in terms of the topic today, government purchasing has long been a really important part of what governments do, accounting for almost 1/3 of government expenditure. That's trillions of dollars spent globally per year. Getting best value from this spending is vital at the best of times, but even more so when government budgets are constrained as they are now. And digital transformation creates an opportunity to do just that, opening procurement opportunities to a wider range of suppliers, creating opportunities for governments to better monitor spend, and ultimately helping providers to deliver better services for citizens. So in today's webinar, we're going to look at how governments can really harness technology to make the most of government purchasing. And we've got a fantastic panel with us here today. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to invite each of them to speak, give some opening remarks. But after they've spoken, it's your opportunity as our audience to put your questions to our speakers. So whichever device you are on, you should see somewhere on the screen a Q&A function. Please use that function at any point from now on to message in your questions. They can be questions for absolutely anything related to what you're hearing or any questions you've brought with you to the webinar. And we'll get through as many of those as we can before the end of today's webinar. So in terms of our fantastic speakers, first we will hear from Sir Hui, who is Chief of Government Procurement and Director at the Government Procurement Function Office in the Ministry of Finance in Singapore, where he oversees policy development on government procurement and workforce development for the public sector procurement community. Sir is also the Executive Director of the Centre for Public Project Management, which works with public agencies to ensure that major public infrastructure projects are efficiently designed and give best value for money. Then we will hear from Mathieu Cahen, who is Senior Policy Analyst in the Public Governance Directorate at the OECD, specialising in public procurement and infrastructure delivery. He's currently working on projects in different regions of the world, including the implementation of a strategic approach to public procurement through case studies with Finland, Chile, New Zealand, and Ireland. And prior to his current role, Mathieu held the procurement and advisory unit in OECD's central purchase. He led it in OECD's central purchasing group, where he was responsible for managing procurement for the OECD and promoting procurement as a strategic tool to support decision-making. Then we will hear from Kevin Cunnington, who is the Executive Advisor to Global Government Forum. Kevin's got a strong track record of helping organisations fully embrace digital technology, and he's held senior positions in investment banking, telecommunication, and the UK Civil Service, where he was head of the government's digital service and the Global Digital Envoy for the UK. Then we will hear from Laura Stanton, who is Assistant Commissioner at the Office of Information Technology in the Federal Acquisition Service at the United States General Services Administration. As Assistant Commissioner, Laura manages the largest IT procurement operation in the United States government and leads a highly skilled and diverse workforce that manages more than 6,000 contracts and around $34 billion in annual government spending, quite eye-watering figures there. Laura also helped play a critical role in the administration's IT modernisation work and creation of a more efficient and effective government for the American people. And then last, but by no means least, we will hear from Matthew Brown, who is Deputy Director of Policy and Communications at the Government Commercial Function in the Cabinet Office in the UK. Matt has led the development of the commercial playbooks, and his team is responsible for developing public sector procurement best practice to maximise value for money and deliver high quality services. Previously, he worked in HMT with a focus on infrastructure investment, public spending control, and financial services sector. So I'm sure you'll agree with me, we really do have a fantastic panel of speakers here today. Please take this opportunity to put your questions to our speakers, as I said, using that Q&A function. But without further ado, I'm now going to invite Sir to give us his opening remarks. Over to you, Sir.
Thank you, Shaban. Good evening from Singapore. When I looked at the topic, getting procurement right in the digital era, actually, I thought there are two perspectives. One is how can we leverage technology for procurement? The other is really about procurement of technology. My sharing will touch more on the former perspective, and I think some of the speakers here will be talking a little bit about the other parts. I think you all agree that technology has presented many opportunities and tools for us to improve the way we make procurement, tools to buy more efficiently, data analysis to better inform our decisions. But actually, it also brings challenges. For example, like it or not, there is pressure for us to keep up when our staff are used to buying easily from e-commerce platforms in their personal lives. And then imagine they come to our office and say they have to contend with very complicated processes. And to keep up, actually, we need to build our digital capabilities and, of course, compete for limited IT talent. I think that actually was what Shilpan was talking about, contending with rising IT complexity and costs. How Singapore has tried to kind of deal with this is to start from the user perspective. We think it's an essential first step in getting procurement right, whether it's in a digital era or not. We start from a reviewing of our processes and policies rather than try to digitalize an inefficient process. The implication of taking the user perspective is also that we need to look beyond the procurement function. We need to take an end-to-end view of what the user goes through, from budgeting to procurement to contract management and payment. And it means we have to work closely with our finance colleagues. So what I'm going to do is share some examples of how we went about looking at this. About 2 years ago, we started efforts to improve the way we make small value purchases. These are actually equivalent to ad hoc maverick buys up to a few $1,000s. Began with a service journey where public officers from several agencies came together, walked through the process, and they identified pain points and then they said, okay, how can we do it differently? To cut a long story short, actually, through that journey, we envisaged a desired process where officers would be allowed to buy from partnering e-commerce malls, just as they would for their own personal buys, using the same portal, and it's billed to the organization. This then provides a common solution that's developed centrally to be used across government agencies. We call this the Quick Buy Initiative. We didn't build a separate portal. We made use of whatever the e-commerce malls have, and then we link up with them at the back end. The logic was that whatever the officers are already used to in their private lives, we use the same thing. But it does require a little bit of a building of a back-end middleware to enable the routing of purchase requests from officers to their supervisors. And then for payment. What used to take on average 2 weeks for users was reduced to about 1 day. There's also an improved financial governance because all the purchases are digitally logged and we can analyze the trends easily. This has also
Sorry, sir, you're on mute. We can't hear you. Just a minute ago.
I think it was accidentally some reason.
Problem. No problem.
I think I was saying that this was possible. I think I left off where it's an improved financial governance because all purchases are digitally logged and we can analyze the trends easily. And it's also possible only because we took a step back and look at the end-to-end processes from payment, finance, and so on. There was also some trade-off, of course, in reaching this outcome because the finance departments have to accept slightly lower precision in their tagging of payments to account code by adopting the standard model. And we needed to design the system to cater to every agency's, or rather, if we needed to design the system to cater to agencies' unique needs, it would be much more complicated. So we also did a trade-off and said, okay, we will adopt a standard one and accept certain standardization, reduction in precision where it's immaterial. Then after that exercise, we're still trying in the process of rolling out. We are currently embarking on a revamp of our procurement portal, GBIS, which is being used for larger procurement for calling public tenders. We are starting a similar approach, reviewing the process end to end, from budget to finance, budget to procure to pay, and contract management. Of course, the complication is that it's much higher value, and there's wider variation from construction to IT services to normal goods and services, much more complex. Some government agencies also have their own unique internal processes, so we need to find some way to get a common kind of landing zone. The issue is that if left to themselves, if left as it is, we risk ending up with multiple different IT systems for different agencies, and it's not very cost efficient. And that's why we wanted to come up with a few standard processes, harmonize our processes first, derive a few common typologies, so that then at least we can work on some common solutions. What we envisage is a network of solutions to cater to different needs. There could be a common base for managing general procurement with different modules connected to it to handle construction procurement or contract management. And as technology progresses, there could be new tools to be integrated. Perhaps generative AI solutions could be incorporated to help drafting of tender specifications and providing guidance to inexperienced officers. I want to close off with just 4 points in conclusion. Really, in digital era, I think we need to streamline, don't tack away inefficiencies. We have to start with reviewing existing processes and practices. And then we need to see across, right? We need to go beyond our traditional boundaries of procurement, looking across the end-to-end process from finance to payment and so on, and weigh the trade-off, right? We need to have some compromise. And we need to sync up. There will always be a tension of needing to come together as a whole ecosystem to have a standard solution versus being nimble to cater to different local contexts. And our approach is not to have one size fits all. We try to have a modular one that try to be synchronized. And we need to have a clear data structure so that the budgeting, the procurement, the payment data is synchronized. Finally, we need to scale up. Technology changes so rapidly that we need to stay abreast. Generative AI is one example. We need to remain agile, open to new technologies. But actually beyond technology, it's about ops tech. Having this group of people who understand operations and technology and can marry the two. So those are actually our observations from our experience.
Thank you so much. That's such a great way to start, because I think you've really covered a lot of the issues I think that will come up that the audience will be interested in. So really interesting to hear how you've kind of started with the smaller spends, as you said, huge though, a lot of pace you've injected there, going down from a 2-week process to a 1-day process. Love the phrase that you put in there, don't digitalize a bad process. As you say, you need to look at the process itself first before you bring in the technology. And then looking ahead to those larger tenders, as you say, getting that balance right between standardizing and harmonizing, but still being nimble where you need to be, and raising those issues then around skills. I'm sure lots of people will have very, a lot in common with that. That will resonate with our audience a lot. Thank you so much, sir. Lots of food for thought already. Mathieu, I'm coming over to you.
No, I'm unmuted. Thanks very much, Jovan. And I very much like the sales point about the need to rethink processes, because oftentimes the digital is just seen as a digital patch on procurement, on existing procurement processes. And this is oftentimes not then producing the expected results, or at least not fully leveraging the potential of the digital age. What I'm trying to do, what I will try to do in the next 5 or 6 minutes is just to try to give you a short overview of what happened at the global stage, what are the main trends, and the evidence that shows countries' progress and practices in precisely trying to get procurement right in a digital era. So if you go to the next slide, so you can see here on that slide that countries are, of course, evolving practices in terms of using and leveraging digital tools. But first of all, you need robust digital infrastructure that would support procurement processes. And what we have seen in, I would say, probably a bit more than the last decade, is that countries shifted from really one-way information portal that were just meant to communicate on government procurement opportunities to two-way transactional system. So really interacting with the private sector, allowing bids to be submitted electronically, providing question answers in an electronic way. This is now very much widespread across all OECD, all 38 OECD countries. Yet it doesn't mean that the full procurement cycle is covered. And what Sarah mentioned really about the necessity to integrate budget, finance, payment, all these elements, we are seeing here room for progress in many countries where those systems are still not focusing enough on the contract management phase, for example, which is of course critical to better understand the impact and the performance of public contracts. So that's, I mean, this is really the overall picture. And you can see here that the data dates back from 2018. So of course there are a few advances now in 2023, but overall we can see these trends. What I would like now to do is just to illustrate how that really translates in practice, giving you one concrete example. And that example, again, considering the period we're at, I think that getting procurement right these days mean certainly not harming the environment with procurement processes and practices. So if you go to the next slide, we launched last year, in fact, a survey to all our OECD countries to try to better understand how countries were doing when it comes to green public procurement. And part of this survey really looked at the way impact measurement was carried out and tried to look at different practices. And first of all, we wanted to see whether countries were leveraging digital tools to report, because arguably reporting through digital tools could automate processes, could ease reporting requirements, could lessen the burdens on contracting authorities. And here what you can see in this graph is that countries in their vast majority are using digital platforms, oftentimes integrated and linked with the electronic procurement system and their national procurement system, or through independent digital means, but which still facilitate reporting. And there are very few countries that still report through Excel files, emails, or paper-based forms. But you can see also, interestingly, that there are some countries, although having strategies and political commitment, national commitments to use public procurement to support and to address climate change, that are still do not require to report. But if you then look at, and if you go to the next slide, if you look then at what is being reported and where it's being reported, you can see here that most of the countries that do report on the value of green public procurement. Some report on the number of public tenders that do report on green public procurement, but very much less report on outcomes, meaning that public procurement is still, and although there are some technological advances and digital advances that would allow to report, few countries are reporting actually on impact and outcomes. They are more reporting on processes, but much less on what it means actually and what are the impact of those strategies. But you can see that there are a few countries that do provide, for example, an aggregation evaluation of the overall impact at national level of procurement, includes green consideration. And again, all this to say that, and very much like what Sarah mentioned, is that fully exploiting the potential of the digital age and leveraging that potential to get procurement right required to rethink processes, to rethink organizations. So processes are better integrated. And so one can understand when a strategic decision is made on one procurement process, what is the actual impact that derive from these strategies. So again, that was just in a nutshell to really share international trends on what happens when it comes to leveraging the digital potential of these days.
Mathieu, thank you so much. Really good to have that, as you say, that global kind of overview to get a sense of what lots of different countries are doing, but also you've brought in that new perspective there of kind of how technology is being used in particular to look at green public procurement through the survey work that you've done in OECD. And as you say, up until now, lots of, well, countries are doing it maybe to measure the value of green public procurement, but not necessarily looking at the impact of that green public procurement. And I think that's really at the heart of what countries are trying to do by putting kind of green factors in the tenders that they put out. So really interesting use of technology there. And as you said, echoing, I think, what Sir was saying, the more technology is used, then the more data that comes out of this that can be used to do that kind of analysis. And also, like Sir saying, that it's important that you rethink and reintegrate all of those different processes, a real fundamental rethink required. Thank you so much, Mathieu. Again, I'm sure lots of people will have questions around the kind of green procurement side, because I know that's a real hot topic in a lot of countries at the moment. Kevin, I'm coming over to you now.
Yeah, so good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. I'm Kevin Cunnington, as Siobhan said. I was the Director General responsible for the Government Digital Service in the UK. And I want to talk about one of our big success stories, which actually is quite an old story now. So we started this 13 years ago, believe it or not, and it was around the digital procurement of digital services. And if I just give you a sense of where we were back in 2010. So in 2010, UK government spent about £16 billion on technology with about 8 suppliers. And we invented a service called the Digital Marketplace, which I'll explain how it works in a second. And by the time my captaincy had finished in 2019, that 16 billion bill was reduced to 9 billion, so nearly half of what it had been. And we had attracted 5,000 SMEs into working with government, or 5,000 SMEs and services into working with government. And we were spending about a third of that £9 billion with those 5,000 companies, pretty much all of whom were based in the UK. So we'd seen a huge transition in the way that government bought technology from working with 8 multinational companies, none of which were really British, to working with some of those same companies, but also with 5,000 new British SMEs. So it's a great growth story, both for digital, but for the UK economy as well. The way the digital marketplace works is it's a catalogue. So on an annual basis, we're now on the 13th iteration of this. Suppliers volunteer their services into a catalogue, describing what they do, how they go about it, kind of what their pricing structures are. And it's therefore very simple for UK civil servants to search across that 5,000, that catalogue of 5,000 services, pick the one that makes most sense. They can still go through an RFP if they want to. They can still have further negotiation if they want to, but they can equally just buy it as read from the supplier. And that's speeded up, in the way that Sir said, the process from going from weeks to hours, really. It's really that simple nowadays in the UK. On the back of this, I've been doing some work with a very small, very pretty Mediterranean country, he says, trying to get them to use such a service as well. And what I've really been surprised about, perhaps what I've taken for granted, really was how much work went into setting the standards for the services you could procure. And I don't think we've really talked about this yet, but I think this is quite an important part of procurement. So in setting up the ability to buy digital service, we did an awful lot of work in setting up things like look and feel standards, accessibility standards, making sure suppliers understood them. We did a lot of work around what it would take to technically integrate with our architectures going forward so that we could use single identities or notification systems. And we did an awful lot of work around testing. So it was really important that whatever we bought from a supplier was tested to our standards. So we kind of instructed suppliers on things like threat modeling, security code review, and penetration testing. And I'd really forgotten how much work we did on the standards of the things we buy compared to how we actually bought it. We tend to look back and say we did a lot of work on procurement, but actually we did way more work on setting the standards for procurement than we did in building the model itself. So that's kind of my thought for the day and the UK experience of 13 years of experience of doing this.
Thanks, Kevin. So great to have that case study from, when you were setting up the UK digital marketplace. Again, echoing what we've heard, just the massive benefits in terms of reducing costs, as you said there, but not just reducing costs, but at the same time, significantly opening up access to suppliers. So in your instance, to the thousands of UK SMEs in particular, reducing the time, like Sir was talking about, reducing the time for potential suppliers from weeks to hours in this process, and then bringing in that issue of standards. I think that is something that other people will touch. I think Sir did mention standards, but the amount of work that went into kind of standards and testing. Thanks very much, Kevin. Laura, we are coming over to you in America.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for the invitation to join all of you today. I've been fascinated by listening to all the fellow panelists. And candidly, I have a ton of things I would love to be able to address. However, I'll keep it to a couple of areas. And then hopefully we can get into some of the other things as through the questions. I see we already have one. But let me start with, I have two roles. You were kind enough to read my bio. For my primary role, which is as Assistant Commissioner, I have 6,000 framework agreements, 6,000 plus framework agreements that sit under me. And the money that goes through that, the 34 billion that goes through those framework agreements, is still only a percentage of what is spent in federal IT at the US government. So last year, just to give you an indication, and we do have digital tools that give me this data. So touching on the digital tool aspect, we spent about $72 billion for information technology contractual services across the US federal government. And so in the second role that I have, I'm also responsible, I'm the government-wide IT manager and responsible for sort of looking at that $72 billion and getting a sense for what's it being spent on? What are the categories of spend? What's the data? What are do we have duplicative contracts? How are we engaging with this supplier community that's a very diverse, broad community? And we have an incredible emphasis on small business. So for us, we're tracked very closely on small business, and not just a small business, but various other socioeconomic categories that we track the spend in, and we look at not only the spend, but we also look at the number of companies that are engaging in business with the US federal government. And a key initiative has been to, like the UK, to expand the number of companies that are selling to the US federal government. And how do we identify those? How do we make sure that we help them understand how to navigate a fairly complex public sector market? So we're doing that. And then once they get a framework agreement, that still doesn't give them money unless they are actually getting task orders. And that's the way that the requirements are structured. And that actually is ultimately what an agency in the US federal government will put out to allow for that. So I'm also the government-wide IT category manager, and we've been applying category management in the United States since sort of around 2015. And it's really looking at how do we buy smarter for those common goods and services. And we recognize that we buy these common goods and services across the government, and that we need to be buying them as an enterprise and not just as a whole series of individual agencies. Some of our largest agencies certainly are able to negotiate very high, they're able to negotiate good discounts. They're able to get the attention of suppliers. However, some of the smaller agencies don't have that same buying leverage. So approaching this as a government enterprise gives us that buying leverage for all of our agencies. And so we've been working to turn the acquisition focus of the acquisition system to be able to do that. So we've also been examining, part of that is using data where, as I said, examining the procurement process, when we determine what we want, how much we want, are we understanding our industry cycles? Is there a better time to be buying laptops and desktops at certain times of the year? Are there cycles? Are there areas where we can do a better, if we have standard requirements? Then it's not a large supplier isn't trying to adapt a product to the needs of every individual agency. Some of these sound like very, very simple, but going back to the idea of standards, going back to the idea of a common approach, that's where we spent a lot of time. We're also looking at the total cost of ownership. What is the total cost of ownership, not just what you're paying up front, but then ultimately what you're paying through the life cycle of that product or that capability to manage it. And we've been using data to drive a lot of that, As I said, we had about approximately $72 billion in IT last year. And we've been able to identify where agencies have potential requirements and could use common contracts rather than having to go forward and put their own together. We've been proactively having conversations across the agencies, giving them visibility into how are they spending, what does their information technology spend look like? So all this is going back to sort of what Sir was saying about, there's two ways to look at this. How are you using technology in the procurement approach? This is actually improving the buying experience of that technology. And then we're also looking at developing government-wide standards when it comes to buying common software. We know that we all rely very heavily on commercial software, commercial capabilities. And so we have an initiative that's helping the federal government buy and manage software licenses in a more consistent manner. And that's led us to both understand some of the common challenges that are faced by the federal government with these software manufacturers, and then also begin to standardize our own terms and conditions that can be used not only in the framework agreements that my organization runs, but that can be used in framework agreements and other contracts across the federal government. We're also supporting small business procurement, as I mentioned. Very proud of the fact that I believe we were at about 37% of that $72 billion went to small businesses last year. So those are some of the metrics that we're using. This sounds fairly straightforward, but it's very much it's complex to get the data. It's complex to get the data in a way that is standardized and that we can identify what's been acquired. But there are huge returns. I had some other points, but what I want to jump to instead of is really talking about some of the digital tools, some of the conversations that the other panelists, so I'm going to adjust a little bit on what I was originally thinking about, that we use a number of digital tools. We have, and I can share some of these, we have a website called the buy.gsa.gov website that's designed for suppliers who want to sell to the government and buyers who want to buy from who need to get capabilities. And that website is a compilation of digital tools that we've developed using the data that we have, and we're constantly working to improve this. But looking at, for services, looking at professional services labor rates. How do you, so you can actually get a comparison and you can put together a cost estimate that's based on the ceiling rates. So you know sort of what the top line that you should be paying is, and you can then negotiate. We also have a buying platform that we've had for years called GSA Advantage. And that is where it's a digital buying platform in which all of these providers, not only the IT, but all of our providers, which are number in the thousands, are able to put up their catalogs and products can be acquired through that. We also, because we recognize that has some limitations associated with it, we've also established contracts and partnerships that allow agencies to use commercial e-commerce platforms for purchases approximately up to $10,000. And that's been, and then we're getting that. Previously, the agencies were going forward They were setting up those agreements with an individual platform. They weren't necessarily competing it and looking at the different capabilities and the different platforms that could be used. And now, because we have an enterprise approach, we're able to gather the data. We're able to look at what should be, are there things that should be strategically sourced that the government is buying individually? Are there risk areas, going back to supply chain? I haven't even touched on supply chain risk. Are there risk areas? Are there products that should be bought, that shouldn't be bought sort of in this way? And this gives visibility into when products that are high risk are being acquired through these platforms, because we're getting that data back. All of this stems back from the data.
Yeah.
And setting up the structures, the processes, standards to get that data, and then also setting up the standards that we're able to put into our master agreements is critical. I just want to touch on one other thing about, how long has it been? About 7 or 8 years ago, I launched a tool called the Acquisition Gateway. And that was designed to be a common platform that distributed acquisition information to federal employees, federal acquisition. What amused me was it was also used a lot by industry professionals to understand better what the government's needs were. And that is just such a key part of all of this. So we're applying technology and data and digital tools to improve the overall buying process. And so let me stop there. I'm sure I've gone over my allotted time. So thank you for the opportunity.
Laura, thank you so much. I'm sure there's lots there. You sound like you could carry on for a lot longer, and I'm sure there's lots that the audience will want to pick up on. But I mean, you kept saying there that a lot of this sounds simple. I think it doesn't sound simple just because of the sheer scale of what you are talking about. I really don't envy you in terms of kind of the amount that you sit over, kind of those 72 billion, as you're saying, in total spend on IT systems. I mean, that's huge amounts. Great to hear, as you were saying, similar to what Kevin was saying, 37% of that now is going on small businesses. But really interesting as well, you were talking about looking at the total cost of ownership, so looking across the kind of life, the whole lifespan of a contract as well, echoing some of what Mattia said as well about understanding the risks on the supply chain, but also getting more data about the supply chain and the impacts there as well. And just really good to hear about some of those digital tools that you have available for people in America as well to help on both sides, including, is interesting what you said, that you launched something that was for federal employees, but actually the private sector have found that useful to have as well. Lots of food for thought there. Again, to the audience, we've got one speaker left. We've got some questions coming in. Please do keep sending your questions in, because we will be turning to those shortly. Thank you so much, Laura. And now, Matt, we are coming over to you.
Thanks a lot, Siobhan, and thanks a lot for the opportunity to come along today and talk about a bit of our experience in the UK. It's been fascinating listening to the other speakers, and I think in some ways very reassuring that everybody is grappling with the same sort of challenges that we are. I'm going to talk a bit today about I suppose a culture change program that we've been running for the last 4 or 5 years from the Cabinet Office, and particularly through the commercial function. And it very much focuses on the sort of procurement of technology services rather than the technology services themselves. So I think there's just sort of 3 quick things I'll try and run you through. So firstly is a sort of quick overview of that program, how we've then applied that to the digital sector, and how we've worked with our digital function to sort of drive some of the objectives they're trying to achieve as well through the procurement process. And then finally, just think a bit about some of the future reform opportunities that we have. So if we just move through the slides, what we've been doing in the last 4 or 5 years is basically setting out what we consider to be best practice for procurement across a number of sectors. And you can see on the slide here that we've sort of captured that in what we call playbooks. So we've got a sourcing playbook, which is the sort of traditional FM sector. We've got a consultancy, a construction, and a digital data and technology playbook. I think the thing to say about how we've gone about this is that, and it was certainly very unusual for me in my career, was that we we genuinely tried to do the development as a sort of joint endeavour between government and industry, and so actually had joint working groups that had representatives of different sectors involved, you know, in the discussions on what the right policy should be. It gave us a really different insight into actually, you know, what can look sensible from our perspective causes real problems for our suppliers. And so I think the thing I would just flag about how we've done this, and I think it's been the most valuable, has just been that dialogue with our supplier base that has been, I think, really, really powerful. There's sort of three key sets of principles that they all try to drive through. I think the first is setting projects up for success. So a real challenge we've seen in the UK has been sort of projects trying to run before they can walk. And actually what we've tried to do is focus on setting things up and getting the sort of building blocks in place at the very start. And we found that actually, you know, the sort of benefits of that are that if it takes a little bit longer at the start, you actually end up doing things quicker. There is a whole category of reforms that are really about having sensible commercial policies in place and not contributing to a race to the bottom on price. And I think this goes to something that a number of the speakers have already picked up, which is about making sure that we're not inadvertently reducing the number of suppliers that can bid for our tenders. So that's the sort of second category. And then the third is just around making sure we have greater consistency of the financial health checks we do of our suppliers. So that's the sort of three consistent things that run throughout them. If we move on to the next slide, I'll just talk a bit about some of the sector specific things that we're trying to deliver through the digital data and technology playbook. And there's obviously lots in there, but I've just tried to sort of capture a few of the key things. And I think maybe the first one is interesting in that I think, you know, we spend a lot of time thinking about the sort of the new and the cutting edge. And I think actually some of the challenge for us is slightly more mundane in that we have quite a lot of legacy systems where we only have a single supplier that can manage that system for us. And so there's a big focus on what do we do with those systems and how do we get to something that's more sustainable, but also how do we avoid getting into that situation in the future. There's a big focus on what we're calling sort of innovation and agile. And this is really about making sure that the sort of procurement process we have in place doesn't stop us doing sensible things in terms of you know, iteration, and you know, we don't want to just work in what we would call a sort of waterfall style where, you know, we know exactly what we want to buy, we go to market for that, and we get bids back. It's actually about learning lessons and innovating. Big focus on sustainability and how you know, the digital services we buy can contribute to our 2050 net zero targets. Really big focus, obviously, and this maybe goes a bit to the point that was mentioned earlier around standardization and just making sure we're sort of capturing government policy around things like cybersecurity, risk allocation and management of those risks. And then, as I've said, making sure that we have a level playing field for SMEs. So that's just some of the things that we've tried to capture in this document. If we just move through to the next slide, I just wanted to quickly touch on a couple of the sort of opportunities that we have for the future. So we obviously have a procurement bill going through our Parliament at the moment, which is a bill that we've drafted following the UK's exit from the EU. There, you know, the objective of that is to make sure that there's greater flexibility in the way that we procure services. And what we're keen to do is work closely with the digital function in government to make sure that we take full advantage of those flexibilities. And then, as I said earlier, we're going to continue working with the digital function to make sure that, you know, the governance of how we approve projects doesn't get in the way of moving in a sort of quick and agile way. And then finally, I just quickly wanted to touch on how we're going about embedding these reforms. So if we just move through to the next slide. I won't go into the sort of detail of this, but I think the main point I wanted to get over here is that we've gone about setting out this best practice, but what we've also done alongside that is set up a team centrally that is responsible for providing training to the rest of the public sector on how to do this in practice. And actually we have a small team of commercial experts who can be parachuted into particularly challenging or high profile projects to help them implement these principles in practice. And so I think that the sort of lesson for us has been actually, in some ways, the easy thing is writing down what we should all be doing. The tricky thing is actually making sure that people have the capability and the capacity to do that in practice. And so, you know, I think we see it as very much a sort of long journey, but, you know, I think we've made good progress on that journey. So I'll pause there, Siobhan, and we can get into some discussion.
Matt, thank you so much. It's interesting because Sir started saying that he would focus more on using technology to improve procurement. And I think you focus then on the other bit of kind of how do you improve procurement for the procurement of technology? So we're getting kind of all of that entire picture, but very interesting to hear about the playbooks in the UK. We can, I am sure, send the link to those playbooks to everybody who is in the audience. We can do that after the webinar, but interesting. I think we can maybe pick on this in the conversation afterwards, but some of the things that you highlighted there about getting the fundamentals right before you launch a new initiative, a new project, getting better at financial health checks of suppliers, because I think every government around the world will have struggled with that at some point where that hasn't gone quite right. And then, as you say, for UK specifically, bringing in new legislation on procurement post-Brexit, so trying to maximise some of the flexibilities there. And then mentioning, which has come up from our other speakers, the importance of skills, so that you're not just putting all of this guidance out there, you're actually creating a team to help kind of upskill and build capabilities across other public servants. So making sure that this can actually be applied in practice. Thank you so much to all of you, so much there in all of our presentations. If any of the speakers have questions for each other, then we can certainly pick those up, because I could see you all kind of nodding along. But I had a first very simple question, I think, in advance, and then we will go to questions coming in from the audience. But I think my simple question, you've all mentioned some of the benefits of improving kind of the procurement processes. So what would you say, I think, if you were a potential supplier, maybe a potential small business supplier, what would you say you would want from an ideal public procurement process? What would that process look like to the supplier? So we haven't heard from you for a while, so I'm going to come back to you for your thoughts on that one.
Oh, okay, that's a difficult question. To be honest, it's a question that we are seriously looking at. And in fact, actually just earlier this week, my senior minister of state, sort of a deputy minister level, just hosted an event with our business association involving small and medium enterprises and Singapore Business Federation. It's to kickstart a dialogue that's going to come up in the next month or so, to engage the businesses to find out really what are their problem statements, what are the pain points they have. I think for those of us in the government, it's very easy to be blindsided. We think, well, you know, whatever we are providing is really helpful. But really, I think at the end of the day, we have to look at it from their angle. What is it that they are feeling? Some typical kind of pain points they flag out is issues like track record. So it's not so much a process thing, but you know, as a small enterprise, I may not have the track record to get access. So they say, well, how can you give me a chance? And maybe a shorter process, not too onerous on them. You know, a long list of contractual clauses is a deterrent. So I think these are the typical usual suspects, but we're trying to find out more.
Brilliant.
So.
Yeah, no, thanks, Sir. Matcha, you were nodding there. Do you agree with what Sir was saying? These some of the issues that you've discovered in the work that you've been doing with different countries?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's always challenging indeed to think about what would a supplier expect. I trust that all suppliers would simply expect to win public contracts and to generate revenue with the public administration. But what we see in some instances is complaints from the private sector about objective overload and having procurement processes that try to address many challenges at the same time, and increasing requirements, standards, to sometimes unreasonable levels, which then are detrimental to their participation. But beyond that, I would say, and that also comes back to the point made by So, I would say that, and it's probably an aspiration from both ends. I would say that I came across a number of, business associations representing suppliers, but also, again, public procurers themselves, that would like to see less adversarial relationship between the public and the private sector, and more collaboration and more frank discussion about challenges and opportunities overall.
Oh, you're on mute, Siobhan.
Kevin, do you want to add to what you've heard there?
Yeah, but actually very tangentially, but one of the topics we haven't talked about today in procurement is corruption. And a large, I mean, not in the case of the UK, so it's very, very magnanimously, but in a lot of parts of the world, we're seeing people adopt open procurement to avoid corruption. And one of the things I would observe is that a lot of people are getting caught by this safeguard. So there are a lot of developing countries in the world that have low levels of corruption, but in the way that they're given money from places like the International Development Bank or the UN Development Programme, they are required to comply with a very strict level of kind of reporting that is designed to root out corruption. So in some ways, I think if we can get procurement better for developing nations, we can help them prove that there isn't corruption in the process and it's open, and that will hopefully help them, make more use of this money without all the bureaucracy that's currently going with it. That makes sense.
Thanks, Kevin. I am going to change the order a little bit, but I will give Laura and then Matt a chance to answer this one. Laura, did you agree with that? In particular, this issue that maybe we're putting too much, governments are putting too many objectives into one kind of tender process, and that it's too much, especially for a small business?
We, as I said, there's a couple of key priorities that have been coming down from the administration, and one of them is cybersecurity and increasing and supply chain risk management. So what does a company's supply chain look like, be it for software or for a product? And then the other one is small business, which we don't have small. Just to clarify, we don't call it small and medium enterprise. We refer to it as small business, and so. But when we look at that, we constantly are trying to understand how well prepared are these small businesses to be able to meet these evolving requirements in cyber, sustainability, and other areas. What are the barriers to entry? What can we do to assist? And we do it on the front end. Like, we look at how we can allow companies with less experience. What if your company is newly formed, but the principals of that company have tremendous experience that they're bringing? So how do we look at that individual principal's experience versus the experience of the company in order to get them a framework agreement? How can they work as a subcontractor with a larger company to begin to get the experience? So how do we hold those larger companies accountable and require that they're actually subcontracting to small businesses? We have contracts that have performance goals, that if you're doing subcontracting, you need to have a certain percentage, 50% of those dollars going to a small business so that they can grow and mature. And that's designed to help those small businesses get an entrance into the market. We also then, if they get a framework agreement, we have coaching and we have sessions. How do you get a task order? How do you understand how to market yourself? And there's we also have a number of nonprofit organizations that are sort of public-private partnerships between the government and industry that help facilitate these conversations. All of this is driven a lot by transparency. A big part of what I do is out talking to industry. We have blog posts, we have forums, we put out requests for information, we put out drafts of our solicitations. We're held accountable for providing feedback on what we get on those, on when we get feedback back, and how are we responding to it. So all of that is sort of part of reducing the barriers to entry and making sure that if we're told that the past performance project dollar value is too high for a small business, we take that feedback and we look at, is that really what's necessary for the agencies to have that high dollar value? Yeah. Because every time we need to look at what the agencies need. So those are some of the strategies that we've used to try and help address some of those challenges.
Thanks, Laura. And that issue of making sure that the big companies are held to account for subcontracting to the small ones goes back to, I think, points that I think Sir made about using technology to kind of manage the contracts as well overall. Matt, we do have a couple of questions coming in, but very quickly, because you mentioned the importance of dialogue specifically with the private sector. So what were the key things they were telling you they wanted?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one, I agree with much of what was just said. I think the thing I'd add is, I think our supplier base really do want us to come to them and have a genuine engagement about the different ways that an outcome can be achieved. And I think that's the word we always use, is trying to think about things from an outcome focused way, rather than saying, well, this is how we've delivered the service previously and we just want to buy the same thing again. So I think there's a point around actually being willing to engage in a sort of genuine dialogue. And then I think just the other thing I would flag is around bid evaluation, and just making sure that we are sophisticated enough in the criteria we set, so that we are also judging people on quality as well as price. Because often what we see is essentially the quality elements are relatively easy to pass, and so everybody gets the same score for quality, and then you end up just judging it on price, and that's actually not what we want. We want people competing on quality as well as price.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to go to the first audience question. So we've got a question in from Warren Smith, and this is about, he said, applying the culture, processes, business models and technologies of the internet era to respond to these raised expectations. The question, I think, at the heart of it is, what barriers need to be overcome to mainstream such approaches to reimagine the profession to be truly digital? So I think this is a question about the profession itself, the procurement profession. So do you think enough thought is going into kind of how we need to, as Warren has said, reimagine the procurement profession? I'm going to, as I said, shake up the order a little bit. Laura, do you want to go first on this one?
So I think we've been truly looking at how can we shake up the procurement profession, and how can we bring in people who are not only at the beginning of their career, because traditionally being especially a contracting officer, who in the United States is the one with the authority to sign these contracts, is something where you start fairly early in your career, and there's years of training associated with it, and it's not been very easy to enter at the mid-career point. And so we've recently made some changes to the policies that enable us to do more hiring at the mid-career and give them a chance to learn. And part of that is designed to get some of that expertise, some of that thinking in here. The other side of it is we consider the acquisition workforce not only the contracting officers, but also the subject matter experts and that is a key part of making sure that we understand the requirements of what we need, and how are we setting requirements. And so all of that is sort of helping design these teams that do help ultimately reimagine how we're doing work. We're also, in my organization, we're also in the middle of doing quite a bit of digitization of our systems and processes that's forcing us to giving us the opportunity to think about things much more strategically and data-driven.
Thanks, Laura. And Matt, I'm coming to you on this question because I think you mentioned kind of the importance of upskilling or training kind of public servants across the ecosystem. So do you think enough investment is going into the kind of skills side of the profession?
So, I mean, it's a challenging one. I think I think it's an area where we could always do more. So I think, you know, we're starting to get really good coverage in our programme, and that's gone beyond just sort of central government departments in the UK, but we're starting to engage with wider public sector, so including the NHS and local authorities in the UK, and I think we get really good feedback on that, and people find it really valuable. But I think for me, there's almost a sort of point before that as well, which is around, you know, it's a sort of skills point for the wider economy as well, I think, and, you know, making sure that we're actually, you know, the school leavers and the university leavers that are going to be the next generation have those right skills to sort of take those steps that we're sort of all hoping to.
Thanks, Matt. Matthew, I'm actually going to go on to the next question, I think, but feel free, any of you, to come back on the skills side if you want. But I think this is an issue that has been raised several times already. So Elaine Blair Christopher has said, what resources are needed to start the procurement digitalisation journey from concept to implementation and maintenance? So how can digitalisation help users meet compliance with the rules? So I think this goes back to kind of your survey. How can technology be used to do that kind of measuring the impact and making sure that suppliers are adhering to what they said they would do?
Well, that's not an easy one as well, but I would say, and just coming back very briefly to the point on professionalization, what we have seen also is the appearance of new job profiles within procuring institution or within procuring department, data scientist, data analytics. So that's also like emerging profile and skills that are embarked into procurement ecosystem. But to go back to the point about what it takes to leverage the digital tools to better measure the outcome. I mean, all these elements we're talking, of course, about investment, and we know that public finance in most of the countries are constrained. What we do see is that it goes quite along with the capability provided to those public institutions to demonstrate the impact of what they are doing, to demonstrate to citizens what they are doing. So I would say, and what we have seen in several countries, in several cases, is that as long as part of the use of those digital tools is to communicate on public administration procurement activity, then the question about budget and training and efforts to invest into these digital capabilities become less of a question, I would say. And we have seen very successful, I mean, talking about SMEs or small businesses, as Laura was saying, we've seen in some countries, in South Korea, for example, quite powerful and comprehensive digital tools and systems being put in place, also precisely because it helped concretely to support, for example, small businesses by reducing payment terms. I think that in South Korea now, suppliers could be paid within 4 hours due to the integration of digital systems. So again, it's a business case, of course, because that represents an investment. And again, coming back to the first point made by Sir, it's not only just a technical investment, it's really rethinking processes, investing in the right capabilities, human capabilities. But again, part of the cost and benefit analysis is also, I feel more and more, is also that capacity to communicate on results. And for example, the green dimension is a clear demonstration of that. Public procurement, interestingly, public procurement is mentioned in national commitments from OECD countries as a tool to fight climate change in 98% of the countries.
Thanks, Mathieu. Sir, I will come over to you then, because I think you also mentioned how digital was going from kind of a one-way kind of portal to a two-way process. So Elaine, going back to Elaine's question, how can technology help then to make sure that people comply with the, what's in those contracts?
Yeah, I don't mean to sound like I'm skirting the question, but I thought, as Matthew highlighted, really we are a little bit kind of back to basics. We shouldn't be we shouldn't take away the inefficiency. So if you're starting from zero, really I think the first step has to be take a look at the end-to-end processes. What are some streamlining we can do and all that? It sounds easy, but actually it's very difficult because in our context, and I guess in many governments, you have many stakeholders, many kind of ingrained kind of processes and rules. Different ones may have, different agencies will have different ones. So how do you kind of address this? And it takes some change management. It takes a lot of persuasion. And it's only after you've kind of resolve that end-to-end process streamlining, then you should be looking, then you can look at it, the IT, because otherwise you're just finding a solution for an inefficient process. That I think is something that we are looking at very seriously. And then once you do that, then you see, okay, are certain parts of compliance best enforced through technology, or are there other simpler ways? That's something, quite honestly, we are grappling with. As Laura was talking about, right? Are our regulations too burdensome to suppliers? I mean, if we layer on too many expectations on procurement, the business suppliers don't know which one to comply, and so we have to streamline our regulations as well. What are the most fundamental ones? Are they best enforced through procurement? And that's a question, because as a procurement function, we get left, right, center from different policy office, other ministries and so on. They say, procurement must support this, procurement must support that. And we have to push back because certain things certain things it's just not optimal to be done through procurement, and it's a balance. Thanks,
Kevin. I'm going to come to you for the final question. I'll give everybody a chance to answer this one, but we're going to have to be very brief, I'm afraid, because I've just looked at the time and we are almost out of time. So Kevin, I think we couldn't do a kind of webinar on procurement in the digital age without looking back over the pandemic period, when I think a lot of countries struggled with issues around procurement. So my question to all of you, but starting with you, Kevin, is what lessons do you think we all learnt from the pandemic period, and can digital technologies help governments to address some of the concerns that arose during the pandemic?
Well, that is a particularly unpleasant question, isn't it? I think the UK had quite a checkered history during COVID, in truth. There were certainly a large number of things we expedited and did very well, but there were a significant number of things where we spent money and didn't get the value, and in some areas didn't even receive the goods. So I don't know, really. I'm not sure that technology would solve much of this, if I'm being brutally honest. I think a lot of things were expedited without the rigor, and actually that was a human decision that made that happen. And I think the truthful answer to this is we should have had better human decision making in some of those processes, and not falsely rely on the technology to help us out.
Thanks, Kevin. Laura, is this a question that you find equally as difficult to answer?
I think I'll approach it with two ways, one broader and one more tactical. The broader is that the pandemic is there's technology that can help us look at supply chains. And that was one thing that came up. And so really using technologies to help us identify supply chains, I think, is an opportunity for that really sort of raised awareness. And then subsequently, some of the challenges that we've been having on chip manufacturing and so on. So that would be the larger answer. On the tactical front, I think one of the benefits of technology and the pandemic was that it also forced us to think about our engagements with suppliers differently, that we moved so much of that to virtual, and that we didn't stop that communication. We just moved it to a platform that actually ultimately is more accessible to most people. And so that is a very tactical plus that resulted from that. So I worked to keeping it brief for you.
Very good. Thank you, Laura. Mathieu, in similarly brief fashion, any reflections on the pandemic period?
Sure, I'll be very brief. We actually collected practices from countries and how they dealt with the pandemic. When it comes to the digital, I mean, it was at the same time a blessing and a curse. So many countries realized they simply had no visibility whatsoever on stocks, on logistic, on supply chains. So if something came up from this, is probably a wake-up call on the need to have better and more visibility. And that comes back to the point made by Laura earlier about supply chain risk management. These came quite clearly throughout the pandemic. But also what we've seen in a few countries is that, for example, digital audits were facilitated precisely because of technology, and where auditors could not go and inspect stocks and so on. So there were some different situations, but overall, again, that really revealed that you need more data. If you want to effectively manage potential crisis, you need better and more data.
Thanks, Mathieu. Matt, any final thoughts from you, especially on the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks for running a really interesting discussion. I mean, I think one thing that's maybe covers slightly different ground then is, I suppose we saw a bit of a glimpse of how you can start to use data throughout the pandemic. And I suppose I'm thinking particularly of the NHS app that, you know, enabled you to prove your vaccine status, or you know, and ultimately linked to your GP records, and you started to see some of how you might be able to use big data to you know, in that case it was to sort of logistically organize stuff, but you know, there's obviously lots of other uses for that. So I suppose that you sort of started to see a glimpse of that.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And so we started with you. I'm going to end with your final 30 seconds thoughts.
Thanks. I think Kevin is right. It is a difficult question, but I liked Laura's kind of response that there is a strategic opportunity in using data to inform the picture, the situation picture. But the tactical response, at least for Singapore, we realized, was that sometimes you have to go down to manual because in a pandemic, whatever the data might tell you, whatever the systems might tell you, might not be fast enough because of all the disruption. Even though you have a contract with certain country, they might not release the stocks to you because they're just holding back the transshipment. So there has to be a lot of human instinct in a crisis to respond quickly. And I think it still comes down to raw skills.
Thanks. For so many of these conversations we have about technology on its own is only, you know, it's only as good as the people who are using it as well. So I think a good takeaway message from that. Well, we are sadly out of time. I just want to say a huge thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, to Laura, to Sir, to Kevin, to Matt, and to Mathieu. Thank you to the audience for sending in those questions. We will be sending a questionnaire out to the audience. So if you do have a few minutes just to fill that in, we'd be hugely grateful because it means we can keep giving you the topics, the webinars with the topics that are of most value to you. So I'd be really grateful if you can do that. To everybody who registered, we will be sending a link with this video so you can watch it on demand if you weren't able to join live as well, but you can share it with your colleagues as well. And there will be an article written up in the next week or so with the key points from the discussion as well. And that will be circulated to everybody who registered for the webinar as well. But for now, a really big thank you from me. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are. And we hope to see you on one of our webinars again very shortly. Thanks, everybody, and goodbye.